Welcome to the second video of the VoD review series, where I delve into one of my videos from the 4.2 Spiral Abyss version. In this episode, I'll be scrutinizing my decision making and strategies, as well as identifying mistakes and highlighting areas for optimization throughout the run. Starting from this version, I decided to involve you, the viewers, in this process. I conducted a recent poll, and based on your choices, I'll analyze halves 12.3.2 and 12.1.1 in this video. You might also recall that in previous videos, I added text at the bottom of the screen to create a dialogue effect among the characters on my team. However, starting from this episode, I'm considering reverting to using regular on-screen text. Toward the end of the video, I'll provide more insight into this decision. In essence, it's to make the workload more manageable, especially given my commitments to graduate school. Moving on to the analysis of 12.3.2, I want to first highlight some general observations I made during the run. To provide context, a common strategy for starter characters involves equipping them with Favonius weapons due to their limited synergy with energy generation. This strategy requires constant character rotations to trigger white particles off cooldown. However, a challenge arises when incorporating Noelle into the team. Given that Noelle needs to be on field to deal most of her damage, a dilemma surfaces. I must decide whether to prioritize dealing damage with Noelle or spending time triggering the Favonius weapon passive. Adding to the complexity, Noelle's optimal combo for weapons other than Redhorn Stone Thresher is N4, yet executing this combo becomes tough when I need to spawn Favonius particles multiple times in each rotation. Typically, I find myself needing to trigger Favonius weapons 7 times in each rotation if I don't hit the enemy HP threshold that drops energy. In contrast to the Hyperbloom team in 4.1 Spiral Abyss, I face a different problem in 4.2. For both Noelle and Xiangling to deal damage effectively, I must remain close to the boss. However, frequent dodging to try to preserve Noelle's shield is also not a good option, as it interrupts Noelle's damage combo. Balancing these factors makes it nearly impossible to fully leverage Noelle's kit, or so I initially thought. Fortunately, I recently discovered a fixed rotation that somewhat fixes these problems. I wish I had discovered the strategy before undertaking this run, but I'll discuss more details about the rotation towards the end of the video. That covers the general aspects. Now, let's delve into the detailed analysis of the video itself. Right at the start, the first thing I should have done was hold Lisa's skill. In all the rotations throughout the whole run, I typically use Lisa's skill last in the rotation. However, upon devising a new rotation, I realized it would be more effective to incorporate it at the beginning, just before Lisa activates her burst. This decision is based on 2 key factors. Firstly, particles take time to reach the active character, and since characters are locked in their animation while casting their burst, casting Lisa's burst while the particles are returning makes good use of the downtime. Secondly, casting Lisa's abilities in this sequence allows her to catch her own particles, avoiding the 60% energy conversion rate multiplier. Another adjustment I overlooked was using Guobo before casting Pyronado. I noticed that when I deploy Guobo first, its final hit applies the Pyro Res debuff late enough into Pyronado's duration, ensuring that the debuff lasts until the final hit of Pyronado. In this instance, I mistakenly swapped to the wrong character in the rotation, choosing Lisa instead of Noelle. This highlights one of the reasons I invested time into creating a more refined fixed rotation. Personally, I find that when I practice and adhere to a fixed rotation, I'm less prone to making such mistakes. To delve deeper into why I recommend other players adopt a fixed rotation, especially with unconventional teams, it's because, from my experience, practicing a fixed rotation allows you to reach a point where you dedicate less attention to the rotation itself. This, in turn, enables you to focus on other crucial aspects during your fight, such as reading enemy body language and dodging. Next, if you're wondering why I didn't cast Lisa's burst at this part, it's because during the middle of the first rotation, I saw the Pyro Aura flickering on the boss when attempting to swirl Pyro using Lynette's skill. This indicated a potential risk of missing the Pyro VV debuff, prompting me to avoid taking that chance again. In hindsight, since I adopted this approach for the second rotation, I should have also skipped Lisa's hold skill. As you might have noticed, I crossed the 75% threshold of the boss, resulting in a drop of 1 energy orb, which was sufficient to fill Lisa's burst gauge. Following that, I made another action that should have been skipped. To provide context, due to the absence of a refined rotation at the time, there were instances where a lingering Electro Aura persisted on the enemy. To facilitate the swirling of Pyro, I would occasionally cast Noelle's burst early to crystallize the Electro Aura. However, in this specific case, there was no Electro Aura present. If I had paid closer attention to the boss's elemental aura, I would have omitted this action entirely. In this next segment, my intention was to chain bursts, allowing me to stand in the center without taking damage from Coppelius' spinning attack. This approach mirrors how I utilized Barbara's burst in the 4.1 Spiral Abyss fight against the Icewind Suite. Similar to the last VoD review, I became a bit greedy and swapped to Lynette, taking damage as a result. Once again, when facing an imminent enemy attack and unsure if there's enough time to dodge after swapping characters, I recommend playing it safe by dodging with a dash first before swapping to the next character. As a reminder from the 4.1 Spiral Abyss run against Coppelius, a helpful tip is to keep your camera pointed at Coppelius when he skates to the outer ring of the arena. This allows you to discern when you should dodge his attacks. However, in my case, I decided to attempt tanking his attack, though I made a mistake in the process. The reason I didn't attempt to dodge it this time was that I believed I had a shield active when it broke much earlier than expected. I intended to utilize that moment not only to spawn white particles, but to also prevent Noelle from receiving a cryo aura, which slows down her attacks. Unfortunately, I wasn't successful in preventing Noelle from receiving the aura, nor preventing Xiangling from taking damage. What I should have done to avoid these issues is pay closer attention to the shield's status. This would have allowed me to gauge when I needed to play more cautiously. In doing so, I could have dodged the cryo attacks because my camera was already pointed at Coppelius. Again, in this part, I try to be greedy, which results in Noelle being stun locked. A better approach would have been to dash away before swapping to Noelle. I also don't need to dash far. I could have remained close enough to avoid losing more than one pyronado hit. I already mentioned this in the original video, but I think it's worth reiterating this next point. Whenever I use a skill with an extended channeling time, I deliberately step away from the boss, especially when there are no bursts like pyronado that necessitate standing close to Coppelia. In essence, if using an ability locks you in an animation for a considerable duration, there's no reason to expose yourself to danger. Take Lisa, for example. If I were to stand in the center with the Ice Wind Suite, she'd be vulnerable for a full 2 seconds, absorbing all the damage from Coppelius. The next point may not be particularly useful for my team, given that it interrupts Noelle's damage combo. However, I'd still like to mention it as it could benefit other players. Coppelia follows the same set of damage intervals in all 3 rotations of her climax. If you're playing a character that doesn't lose much damage when dashing, you can time your dashes to coincide with Coppelia's attacks. This does require memorizing her attack sequence and preemptively pressing dash, as she doesn't provide noticeable indicators for when to dash. However, this technique allows you to keep yourself relatively safe while still standing near her. When using dashes, ensure they are directed straight toward Coppelia to counter her pushback. In my specific case in this footage, I had to dash because I realized that I couldn't rely on the shield to protect me most of the time, especially as my only shield in this part is a crystallized shield. Instead of facing directly forward, however, I angled a bit to the right. Moving counterclockwise in this manner helps pyronado hit slightly more frequently during its duration. This next part is a small detail, but something I've noticed numerous times in this whole run is that I hold Lisa's skill longer than necessary. Sometimes I'm even holding it up to half a second long, when I could have released it much earlier to save a bit of time. The remainder of this fight isn't particularly interesting as Coppelia calms down, allowing me to focus on taking down the boss. However, what I believe is worth analyzing is how to enhance my dodging against this boss. As you all probably noticed, there were several instances where I could have dodged more effectively. Subsequently, I dedicated some time to practicing dodging against Coppelia's climax off camera after the run, and I'll now share what I discovered. Firstly, it's important to note that if you intend to stay point blank in front of the boss, you'll need to utilize double dashes on several occasions to dodge specific attacks. Given the frequency of Coppelia's attacks, there are instances where you may need to swap characters to reset the dash cooldown, allowing you to dash a 3rd time to evade damage. Next, let's slow down the footage to look into my strategy for dodging this boss's attacks during Coppelia's climax. When Coppelius initiates his spin attack, I focus on the baton initially. As soon as I see him accelerating the movement of his baton, I execute the first dash. Afterward, I prefer running clockwise in the same angular direction as Coppelius' movement. Given the numerous damage ticks during his attack, moving in this manner allows me to stay away from Coppelius for a slightly longer duration. To dodge his last instance of damage, I dash counterclockwise to ensure I iframe it. Following this, there's about a 2-second window before you have to dodge Coppelia's AoE Anemo attack. To time this dodge, I keep my eye on her fan. As soon as I see it drop, I execute the dash. When facing Coppelius' cryo attacks, as long as you keep your camera facing toward him, you can use the cryo attacks themselves, or more specifically, their distance from your active character, as indicators for when to use the next 2 dashes. Coppelia follows up with a triple Anemo slash attack. Unfortunately, I don't know of a reliable way to iframe all 3 of these attacks using only dashes, so I walk away from the first hit in a sequence and then double dash back into the boss to iframe the 2nd and 3rd hits. For the last 2 instances of AoE damage from Coppelia, the only indicator I could use to determine when she unleashes her attack is when her hands dip down. However, I find that she executes her attack very quickly after the dip, So instead, I've memorized the timing for when to dash. As for figuring out how to balance dealing damage with dodging, that will depend on the character you're playing. For me personally, I'll have to spend more time later to figure out how to balance damage and dodging with Noelle on top of spawning more white particles. Moving on to 12-1-1, which was undoubtedly the most challenging half for me. In fact, this single half accounted for more than half the total reset count for the entire run. Firstly, I want to clarify a point I mentioned in the original video regarding the importance of preventing Dendro Traveler's burst from exploding. It's crucial that I avoid placing his burst near any pyro shields because the burst triggers a burning aura on his shield, and this burning aura then comes into contact with the burst. In this specific run, I found that long-term Dendro application and the 4-piece Deepwood Memories debuff were more important than Kale's fast Dendro application in a short period of time due to the tankiness of the enemies. Therefore, it was imperative to keep that burst alive. To ensure it doesn't detonate at any point after its initial placement, I make sure Barber's ring touches the burst as soon as I spawn it, preventing it from undergoing pyro transfiguration. Next, there was a slight rotation mistake here. I should have swapped to Kaya instead, since his cooldown would have been ready first. Instead, I awkwardly normal attacked on Dendro Traveler, which wouldn't have been effective anyway since the Favonius weapon's passive was still on cooldown. This point was emphasized in the original video, but it's worth reiterating as this mechanic led to some resets. In the second wave, my first priority is to break the pyro shield. Since Dendro Traveler's burst is still active at the beginning of the second wave, there's a risk it could trigger a burning aura on his shield. If one of the Rift Wolves comes into contact with the burning aura, and the Surgent manifestation also applies Dendro on the Rift Wolf, that particular Rift Wolf will also receive a burning aura, preventing me from freezing it. In hindsight, to circumvent all these issues, it would have been better to use only Kale's burst in the first wave. This is because its AoE won't reach the enemies in the second wave if it's still active at that point. One small optimization here would be to use Kaya's skill before his burst. This not only generates particles for him to catch but also applies cryo sooner, reducing the risk of the Rift Wolf unfreezing. Some of you might be wondering why I never went for the Abyss Mage after breaking its shield. Surprisingly, even though it gets pushed back, the Dendro Core still managed to finish it off before it gets pushed out of range of the AoE damage. Thus, I can ignore the Mage and focus on the Rift Wolves instead. During the Bloom spam against the Rift Wolves, I noticed that I had nearly a full stamina bar at my disposal. This would have been an opportune time to alternate between normal attacks and charge attacks to apply Hydro more rapidly. For context, the Hydro application internal cooldown is not shared between normal and charge attacks, at least not for Barbara. Hence, I can exploit this to expedite the Hydro application process. Something subtle I attempted here is standing close to the Rift Wolves when they use their double swipe attack. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a way to prevent them from triggering Hyper Bloom on my Dendro cores. Nevertheless, Hyper Bloom still inflicts AoE damage, albeit very small AoE, prompting me to try to make the Rift Wolf take damage from the Hyper Bloom as the Dendro cores hit Barbara. But I don't believe I stood close enough to pull this off, so I should have dashed forward into the Rift Wolf when attempting to iframe its attack. For the beginning of Wave 3, if you're wondering why I had to group these enemies up initially, it's because they were standing just far enough from each other that Kaya's burst and Barbara's skill AoE range couldn't hit all three of them. Additionally, if you watched the extra footage at the end of the original video, you would have seen that I couldn't just step to the side to lure one of the Primuses closer to the other. Honestly, I don't know why the Primuses path in a large circle around the player when standing relatively close to them. This behavior occurs on either side of the Primuses. Furu and I couldn't find a way to group them up without running extremely far to the other side of the map. Nevertheless, even when running to the other side of the map, the Lecter is still too far away from the Primuses for Barbara's skill and Kaya's burst to hit everything. Thus, I had to rely on poise damage to knock the Lecter back into the Primuses. Providing more context, all attacks in this game deal poise damage, but the hidden poise damage values differ depending on the attack. Personally, I didn't memorize them. Instead, I got a feel for which attacks are the strongest in a team and figured out a sequence of abilities that was best for each situation requiring poise damage. Kaya's burst alone is sometimes sufficient to poise break enemies, but for Wave 3 specifically, I found that I didn't need to push the Lecter that much, so I opened with Kaya's skill to funnel the particles into himself, and then poise broke the Lecter of Kaya's burst, followed by Dendro Traveler's skill to push it further into the Primuses. For players who don't have a specific timing like mine, you can either zoom out with your camera to get a better view of the top of the Primuses, or observe when the green branches disappear, signaling the firing of the Lush missiles. In my case, I only needed to iframe it once because freezing them stops the next attack completely. Overall, the sequence of abilities I used here aims to minimize any downtime. More specifically, this sequence optimizes the run by reducing the amount of time I spend standing around doing nothing or waiting for the next attack. The shield phase of the Lecter is undeniably the most challenging part to handle in the entire run. As mentioned in the original video, every time the Lecter suffers significant recoil, its hitbox can push the Primuses around. In every instance where I inadvertently recoiled the Lecter into the two Primuses, that alone was enough to reset the run, because I spent too much time trying to use poise damage to group them together before they started moving again. Instead, I make sure to stand in a position that causes the Lecter to face to the side, so when it recoils for the first time to spawn the shield, it doesn't crash into the Primuses. Here's a small awareness problem. In this part, I tunnel visioned the Lecter and almost caused Barbara to die. If I was paying attention to the Primuses again, I would have hit Q on Barbara as soon as I saw the branches drop. That would have prevented the unnecessary risk of almost dying here. In this next part, my primary concern was that the Lecter was still separated from the two Primuses. As soon as I broke the Ominous Star, I dashed behind the Lecter to make it recoil closer to the center of the two Primuses. However, if I had initially positioned myself closer to the Lecter and spawned the Ominous Star near it, I could have preemptively made the Lecter face away from the Primuses, eliminating the need for it to turn around mid-recoil. To provide context for the next point, if the team I'm using does not follow a fixed rotation, such as this Bloom team, my strategy would be to keep an internal timer for each cooldown on the team. Around this point in the run, I knew that Dendro Traveler's ability should soon come off cooldown, so I prepared to cast his abilities here and refresh his 4-piece Deepwood Memories debuff. However, once again, I have to be aware of the sources of pyro that could blow up the Surgent manifestation, so I kept an eye on the Lecter. I observed it using the Flame of Salvation attack, so I waited until the fireball hit the ground before casting Dendro Traveler's Burst to ensure that the attack doesn't blow up the Surgent manifestation. There's one thing I could have executed better here. Using poise damage to push the Primuses together was the right move, but I should have repositioned myself on the other side of the Primuses and alternated between Barbara's charge attacks and normal attacks. That way, most of the Hydro and Cryo abilities would have hit the Lecter too. If I had done that, I would most likely have defeated the Lecter around the same time that I defeated the Primuses. I mentioned that I would showcase footage of the new rotation I developed. This rotation aims to extract more value from Noelle by incorporating two N4 combos. Excluding the initial burst casting damage on Noelle, I usually only manage to get 8 hits off in the old rotation. Two N4 combos also comprise 8 hits, but it's a more efficient use of Noelle's potential compared to a few N2 or N3 combos. The current rotation lasts for 22 seconds, but I believe it can be condensed to 20 seconds. I'll discuss the optimization after explaining the rotation. Additionally, this rotation also aims to funnel particles more efficiently, particularly for Lisa. In the previous rotation, I would often swap off Lisa and Lynette to expedite rotations, even if it meant incurring the 60% energy conversion rate multiplier. However, in the current approach, I strive to use Lisa's abilities in an order that allows her to funnel particles into herself during the animation of her burst. As for Lynette, I haven't figured out how to achieve the same effect of her, so I focus on funneling more white particles into her. Anyway, this rotation starts off with Lisa's hold skill into burst, but I wait a little bit before swapping to Lynette, allowing Lisa to catch her own particles. Next, I activate Lynette's burst to buff Xiangling. Following that, I summon Golba first and then unleash Pyronado. Even if I drop Golba first, the Pyro Res debuff should still persist until the end of Pyronado's duration. Subsequently, I wait for the Pyro Aura to stabilize a bit and then use Lynette's skill to swirl Pyro, although I don't stay on her to funnel particles into herself. Moving forward, I trigger Noelle's burst and execute one N4 combo. By this point, Xiangling and Lynette's Favonius weapon passive should be off cooldown, so I initiate normal attacks on Xiangling first and then Lynette. Afterward, I return to Noelle to perform another N4 combo. Lastly, I wrap up the rotation with Xiangling's normal attack again. Regarding generating additional white particles at the end, this is likely unnecessary in the Spiral Abyss, because assuming I deal enough damage, I should force some extra particles out of enemies in a rotation. So skipping the last normal attack on Xiangling could save 1 to 2 seconds. However, I should bear in mind that Noelle's shield cooldown is 24 seconds. Given that the rotation is less than 24 seconds long, I'll have to use this ability in a way that doesn't disrupt the rotation. Now that I've concluded the VoD review, I'd like to address the matter I mentioned at the beginning of the video. After completing the first quarter of my Master of Science degree, I noticed that the workload became increasingly burdensome, reaching a point where creating videos for my channel became nearly unsustainable. So starting from now, to make things much more manageable for me, I may sometimes reduce the VoD review to analyzing only one half instead of two. In extreme cases, if the workload becomes overwhelming, I might have to skip the VoD review for that particular version. Additionally, there might be some other changes to the videos on the channel to help me alleviate the workload, but I haven't fully decided on what to do yet. I'll occasionally provide updates on this in the future, but they should be minor changes like the one I described for the VoD review format just now. Anyway, if you have any concerns about these changes, feel free to share them in the comments. Other than that, I have no other updates, so I'll see you all in the next version.